The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 4B in the Crestwood County Courthouse hummed like they were counting down to something. Outside, Ohio's gray autumn sky pressed against the tall windows. Inside, the room smelled like old wood polish and fear. 19-year-old Marcus Hale sat at the defense table, a second-hand Navy suit hanging off his thin shoulders like it belonged to someone twice his size. His hands steady, despite everything rested on a legal pad covered in handwriting so small it looked like code. Beside him sat his mother, Diane Hale, 44 years old, 18 years as an administrative clerk for the Crestwood Community Development Authority. Her fingers, still stained faintly from decades of paperwork and printer ink, trembled around a folded tissue. Diane was charged with felony wire fraud and embezzlement, accused of siphoning $340,000 from a city housing renewal fund into an offshore account. The number alone was almost comedic. Diane didn't have a passport. She'd never used online banking without her son walking her through it on the phone. But the city needed someone to blame. And Diane Hale, quiet, compliant, and without money for a real defense, was easy to feed to the machine. Leading the prosecution was Vivian Cross, sharp-suited, ice-eyed, a name attorneys in 3 counties said with equal parts respect and dread. She had a 96% conviction rate, built on aggressive objections, theatrical cross-examinations, and an instinct for finding exactly where a defendant was weakest. Marcus wasn't supposed to be the one standing here. He'd been 2 semesters from a degree in applied mathematics at Ohio State, a kid who solved differential equations the way other people scrolled their phones. Then his mother was arrested. Their accounts were frozen, and the public defender assigned to her a man named Whitfield, carrying 214 open cases, told her flatly that her best option was a plea deal. 12 years reduced from 20. Marcus refused to let his mother disappear into a number. He'd spent 5 months living out of the Crestwood Public Library's reference section, reading the federal rules of evidence beside high schoolers cramming for the SAT. He filed a motion invoking Ohio's rarely used lay advocate provision, a statute that allowed a close family member to represent a defendant in cases where adequate counsel could not reasonably be secured. Judge Walter Hammond, 2 years from retirement and visibly unenthused about this becoming that kind of case, looked down at the petition like it might bite him. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to be clear with you. This is not a classroom exercise. The prosecution has assembled what I'm told is a formidable case. Are you certain you understand what you're undertaking?" "I do, Your Honor," Marcus said. His voice cracked once, then steadied. "My mother is innocent. I intend to prove it." Across the aisle, Vivian Cross didn't even look up from her notes. "Your Honor, with respect, we're prepared to proceed whenever the court is ready to stop indulging this." A few quiet laughs rippled from the gallery. Marcus didn't flinch. Behind his calm exterior, his mind was already doing what it always did, cataloging, cross-referencing, building a structure no one else in the room could see yet. The gavel came down. The trial had begun. The first 2 days were a clinic in dismantling a 19-year-old, sentence by sentence. Every time Marcus rose to question a witness, Vivian Cross was on her feet before he finished his first sentence. Objection leading. Objection, speculation. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is citing a statute that's been superseded since 2011. Judge Hammond sustained nearly everyone. "Mr. Hale," he said wearily, "knowing the words isn't the same as knowing how to use them." The gallery, packed with law students who'd heard rumors about the kid representing his own mother, watched with the particular cruelty of an audience that came for a spectacle. Diane sat rigid beside her son, watching him get cut down again and again, her hands white-knuckled around her tissue. The prosecution's star witness was a forensic accountant named Dr. Ellis Granger, hired by the city to walk the jury through what looked, on paper, like an airtight case. Digital authorization logs showing Diane's employee credentials initiating 6 wire transfers over 4 months. When Marcus rose to cross-examine, he held a printed stack of server logs he'd subpoenaed himself. "Dr. Granger, Can you confirm the IP address listed for these transfers originated from a terminal on the fourth floor of the Development Authority building? That's correct. And isn't it true my mother's keycard access didn't extend to the fourth floor? Vivian Cross was up instantly. Objection. The witness is an accountant, not a building security expert, and counsel is attempting backdoor testimony about access logs that were never properly authenticated. Sustained, Hammond said. Mr. Hale, stay within the witness's expertise. Marcus tried again. 3 different angles. 3 more objections. 3 more sustained rulings. Each time, the gap between what he knew and what he was allowed to say widened a little further. By the time he sat down, his shirt was damp with sweat under the borrowed suit, and the look on several jurors' faces wasn't sympathy. It was second-hand embarrassment. Vivian Cross stood, smoothed her blazer, and addressed the jury with the easy confidence of someone who had already won. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the impulse to root for the underdog, but a courtroom isn't a movie. The evidence here is simple, and it is devastating. As she walked back to her table, she passed close enough to Marcus to murmur, "Just for him. You should have taken the deal, kid." That night, Marcus didn't go home. He sat in his car outside the courthouse for 40 minutes before he could make himself drive to the library, replaying every objection, every sustained ruling, searching for the pattern underneath the noise. Day 3 brought Exhibit 14, the piece of evidence the prosecution had built its entire case around. It was a digital audit trail, a spreadsheet of login timestamps that placed Diane Hale's employee ID at the exact terminal, at the exact moments the fraudulent transfers were authorized. Marcus had spent 3 sleepless nights cross-referencing those timestamps against his mother's shift schedule, badge swipe records, and a detail almost no one had bothered to check: the building's elevator maintenance logs. He stood, gripping the podium. Your Honor, I move to suppress Exhibit 14. The metadata on these logs is inconsistent with objection. Vivian Cross's voice cracked across the room like a whip. Your Honor, is the defense now claiming this teenager is a certified digital forensics examiner? He has no degree, no certification, no standing whatsoever to interpret server metadata. This is a desperate attempt to drown the jury in jargon he pulled off some forum at 2 in the morning. Laughter, low but unmistakable, moved through the gallery. Diane lowered her face into her hands. Marcus felt his face burn, but he didn't sit down yet. Your Honor, if the court would just look at the raw timestamps. Denied, Mr. Hale, Judge Hammond said, gavel already rising. You are not a recognized expert, and I will not permit unauthenticated technical testimony from counsel table. One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt. I warned you this would happen. Marcus sat down. The motion was dead. The evidence stood, and for the first time since this began, something in his chest went cold, and still not despair exactly, but the quiet, total clarity of someone who has just understood that the rules, as written, were never going to save his mother. He didn't have the credentials to be believed. So credentials weren't the path. Something else was. That evening, as court adjourned, Vivian Cross passed the defense table one last time. Tomorrow I rest my case, she said, not bothering to lower her voice. Friday, your mother's in a transport van. Go home, kid. You're out of your league. Marcus said nothing. He watched her heels click away across the marble floor, and for the first time all week, he almost smiled. She thought she'd won by enforcing the rules. She had no idea he'd spent 5 months learning exactly where those rules had cracks. Rain hammered the basement windows of the Crestwood Public Library. It was 3:04 a.m. Court, resumed in less than 7 hours. Marcus sat on the floor, surrounded by a half-collapsed wall of case law, statute books, and the 5,000-page discovery file the prosecution had dumped on him weeks earlier, so massive it was clearly meant to bury anything important rather than disclose it. If he couldn't win through procedure, he had to prove the prosecution's case itself was built on something illegal. He went back to first principles. The Constitution doesn't bend for credentials. It bends for violations. At 4 to 10 a.m., he found the first thread. Buried in the city's emergency asset seizure filings was the fact that Diane's home and savings had been frozen before any conviction under a municipal forfeiture ordinance, Ordinance 217, that required, when federal housing funds were involved, a mandatory 72-hour review by a federal magistrate. Vivian Cross had skipped it entirely, routing the seizure through a local judge instead. A procedural shortcut. Convenient. Illegal. But that was a crack. He needed the wall to fall. At 4:50 a.m., he found it. Buried on page 3811 of the Discovery Dump a Place. No human being reads carefully unless they're looking for exactly this. Was an internal email between the city's IT department and the prosecution from a technician named Calvin Reyes, sent 6 weeks before trial. Miss Cross, per your request, we ran diagnostics on the 4th floor terminal listed in Exhibit 14. We found a remote access tool installed on the machine. The login sessions attributed to employee ID 2249 Diane Hale were initiated externally, routed through 3 proxy servers, the last one based overseas. Her credentials were compromised, not used by her. Full report attached. Marcus stopped breathing for a second. Vivian Cross had known. Weeks before trial, she had received hard forensic proof that Diane's credentials were stolen, and she'd buried it, choosing instead to put a 19-year-old's mother in front of a jury anyway. This wasn't a weak case. This was a Brady violation, the deliberate suppression of evidence that could exonerate a defendant. One of the gravest sins a prosecutor can commit. It wasn't just unethical. It was potentially criminal. But Marcus knew yelling about an email wouldn't be enough. Vivian Cross would call it a draft, inadmissible, irrelevant, and Judge Hammond, exhausted and skeptical of him already, might let her get away with it. He needed to lock her into a lie, on the record, in front of the whole courtroom, and then show the proof. By the time gray light crept through the basement windows, Marcus had a plan. He changed his shirt in the library bathroom, looked at his reflection, and didn't see the trembling kid from day one anymore. Courtroom 4B was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread overnight the kid representing his mother is about to get destroyed. Law students lined the back wall. A local reporter sat in the front row, pen ready. Diane reached for her son's hand under the table. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "You did your best." "I'm not finished, Mom," Marcus said quietly. "Watch." Judge Hammond took the bench. "The prosecution has rested. Mr. Hale, does the defense have any final evidence before closing arguments? I remind you, no more theatrics." Marcus stood. No notes this time, no trembling hands. "Your Honor, the defense calls its final witness." He paused, then turned and looked directly at the prosecution table. "The defense calls Assistant District Attorney Vivian Cross to the stand." The room went dead silent. Then it broke into noise all at once. Gasps, murmurs, a reporter's pen clattering to the floor. "Mr. Hale," Judge Hammond said, leaning forward, stunned, "you cannot simply call opposing counsel as a—" "Your Honor, I'm invoking Ohio Revised Code 2945.41, Marcus said, calm and clear, "which permits calling opposing counsel as a witness when that attorney holds non-privileged information central to an active claim of prosecutorial misconduct, and that information cannot reasonably be obtained by any other means." Vivian Cross shot to her feet, color rising in her face. "Objection. This is an outrage, a stunt. I demand he be sanctioned immediately." "I'm prepared to make an offer of proof, Your Honor," Marcus continued, ignoring her. "If Miss Cross declines to take the stand, I will move for immediate mistrial with prejudice based on a knowing and deliberate Brady violation, the suppression of exculpatory forensic evidence proving my mother's digital credentials were compromised by an external intrusion, evidence the prosecution received 6 weeks before this trial began. Brady violation. The 2 words landed in the courtroom like a dropped weight. Even jurors who didn't know the legal term understood the tone in which it was said. Judge Hammond's expression shifted from impatience to something far more serious. "Miss Cross," he said slowly, Are you aware of any exculpatory evidence in this case that was not turned over to the defense? No, Your Honor, Vivian Cross said, recovering her composure with practiced smoothness. This is a fishing expedition. He has nothing. Marcus let the lie sit in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Let the record show, he said, that Miss Cross has stated under oath that no such evidence exists. Then he turned, took a folder from the defense table, and handed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, this is Defense Exhibit 31, Marcus said, his voice steady as the bailiff passed copies to the judge and finally to a suddenly pale Vivian Cross. A time-stamped email from city IT technician Calvin Reyes to Miss Cross's official government account dated 6 weeks before trial. It documents a confirmed remote intrusion on the terminal, used to frame my mother proof her credentials were stolen, not used by her. The gallery erupted. The reporter in the front row was already typing. That document is inadmissible, Vivian Cross stammered, her composure cracking for the first time in 3 days. He must have hacked into city email. That's a federal. I didn't hack anything, Marcus said evenly. I subpoenaed the IT department's maintenance correspondence weeks ago. It was sitting in the 5,000 pages of discovery your office handed me buried on page 3,811, hoping I wouldn't read that far. You hid the needle in the haystack, Miss Cross. You forgot I'm good at finding needles. Judge Hammond was reading the email himself now, his face darkening with every line. Miss Cross, is this document authentic? It was preliminary, inconclusive. We didn't find the technician's methodology reliable enough to— You didn't believe it? Judge Hammond's voice rose to a volume no one in that courtroom had heard from him in years. It is not your job to decide whether exculpatory evidence is credible before disclosing it. It is your constitutional obligation to turn it over. Full stop. This is a textbook Brady violation, Counselor, and you know it. There's more, Your Honor, Marcus said, and something in his tone made the room go quiet again. Because Mr. Reyes' report doesn't just prove my mother's innocence, it traces the intrusion. He walked to the center of the floor. The remote access tool on that terminal was installed using login credentials belonging to Detective Frank Doyle, the lead investigator the city assigned to this very case. Detective Doyle accessed that terminal 9 times in the 2 weeks before the fraudulent transfers began. Phone records subpoenaed from his department-issued cell place him in 3 separate calls with City Councilman Roger Ashford during that same window. The councilman, who personally chairs the committee overseeing the development fund my mother is accused of stealing from. A new wave of noise broke across the gallery. Diane Hale's hand flew to her mouth. Your Honor, Marcus said, my mother didn't steal $340,000. Someone used her stolen credentials to make it look like she did, while the real money moved into accounts connected to Councilman Ashford's Shell Development Company, and the lead detective on this case had the access to make that frame-up possible. Vivian Cross sat down heavily, all color gone from her face. Judge Hammond stared at her, then at the folder in his hands, then at the boy who, 3 days ago, he'd warned not to waste the court's time. Judge Hammond called a recess that lasted 4 hours. When court resumed, the room felt different, quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that comes after something has genuinely changed. In light of newly disclosed evidence, Judge Hammond said, and a credible, well-documented allegation of prosecutorial misconduct, this court is declaring a mistrial with prejudice. The charges against Diane Hale are dismissed. He paused, looking directly at Vivian Cross. This matter is being referred to the State Bar Association and the Ohio Attorney General's Office for investigation both into the suppression of evidence and into Detective Frank Doyle's conduct. Diane Hale broke down in her chair, and Marcus, for the first time in her. Outside the courthouse, reporters who'd come expecting to cover a humiliating defeat instead filed stories about a 19-year-old who had taken down a sitting prosecutor and exposed a city councilman in the same afternoon. Within a week, the state opened a formal investigation into Roger Ashford's development fund. Detective Frank Doyle was placed on administrative leave pending charges of evidence tampering and conspiracy. Vivian Cross resigned from the district attorney's office, before the bar investigation concluded. Marcus Hale didn't go back to finish his math degree that semester. Instead, with a partial scholarship from a legal aid foundation that had read about his case, he enrolled in pre-law, not because he wanted to be Vivian Cross, polished and ruthless, but because he'd learned something during those 5 months in a library basement. The law isn't a wall built to keep people like his mother out. It's supposed to be a set of promises. Most people just never get shown where the promises are written down. On the courthouse steps, a young reporter asked him what he wanted people to take from what happened in Courtroom 4B. Marcus thought about Judge Hammond's warning on the first day the law is not a playground for amateurs, and about Vivian Cross's whisper, "You're out of your league. They told me I didn't belong in that room," he said. They were right in a way. I didn't belong there as a lawyer. I belonged there as someone willing to read every single page they hoped I'd skip. He took his mother's hand, and together they walked down the courthouse steps, past the cameras, into a city that for the first time in 5 months felt like it might actually be fair.